Thanks, Kim. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of the Legacy of the Black Wall Street Tragedy. And our presenter today again is Dr. Fred Johnson. Today's title is Because They Could. Very meaningful. And some notes about that. By 1900, the United States had fully embraced Jim Crow segregation. Protected by law and nurtured by hate, racist tyranny tightened its chokehold through repeated acts of white mob violence. And that gives you a little idea of what we're going to hear from Dr. Johnson today. You heard and saw photos and videos about the white mobs attacking Black Americans last week. And so we're going to continue with that today. And I think you already know that Dr. Johnson has been teaching in the history department at Hope for over 20 years and has degrees from Bowie State University and Kent State. And he also holds an MDiv from Western Theological Seminary here in Holland. So the other thing I'd like to mention is that Dr. Johnson really prefers if you wait, please, if you're going to ask a question, maybe not necessarily in chat, but if you're going to ask a question live after the presentation, that's when he would like to hear from you. So with that, I would like to say good morning to Dr. Johnson and turn it over to him.
Thank you, Kit, for that very gracious and wonderful introduction. And good morning, scholars of HASP. I will now go ahead and get started. I'm going to do the share screen real quick and we'll dive right into this. As Kit pointed out, today's session, Legacy of the Black Wall Street, Part 2, Because They Could. And just bear with me as I reread what Kit said. Picking this up now, by 1900, the United States had fully embraced Jim Crow segregation, protected by law. And Jim Crow was a thing that was protected by law, nurtured by hate, racist tyranny, tightened its chokehold through repeated acts of white mob violence. And I think it's appropriate for us to spend at least a moment pondering, reflecting upon, zeroing in on the part that says the tyranny. To understand what happened in the Black Wall Street, to understand what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to understand anything else that I have mentioned in the previous session or today or next week, we have to come to grips with the fact that inside of this democratic republic, inside of this society, inside of this nation that prides itself on its Republican democratic history, and it is a legitimate Republican democratic history. However, inside of that nation, a space was made and created, sustained, perpetuated, and nurtured to accommodate tyranny. Tyranny where a minority or minorities at various times throughout our history have been the subject of state-sponsored or nationally sanctioned exclusion, harassment, and terror, and they have been not had any kind of recourse through the law, through the military, through the courts, anything. They have been left completely vulnerable and defenseless. And that is usually what happens when people are dealing with or suffering in a place where there is tyranny. Now, I want to start here. Something that happened a few years ago, which frankly was in the category of it's about time, and it was kind of too little, too late. But thank God they did it anyway. It happened on June 13th, 2005. Tyranny and the Black Wall Street. Tyranny inside of a democratic republic. Tyranny that led to this thing in June 13, 2005, long overdue, but a response to a tyranny that had gone on for way too long. And finally, somebody in the Senate was trying to make amends. On June 13, 2005, the subject of that tyranny was this gentleman right here, At the time, he was 88 years old. His name was Dr. James Cameron, lived from 1914 to 2006. Dr. James Cameron, to my knowledge, I think is the only man to ever, the only person, the only black man ever to have survived an attempted lynching. I showed you all the photos last week of the crowd standing beneath the bodies of Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp, who were lynched by a mob on August 7th, 1930. There was a third man that was supposed to have been lynched that night, or that the mob wanted to get that night. I would not say he was supposed to have been lynched, but there was a third man, a third individual that the mob wanted to put in the tree that night and kill him also, and it was James Cameron. He survived. What happened was that Senator Mary Landrieu, at the time, a Democratic senator from Louisiana, and again, she is from the state of Louisiana, and Senator George Allen, Republican representing the state of Virginia. Senator Landrieu and Senator Allen both had gotten their hands on, or somehow had become acquainted with, knew about this book called Without Sanctuary. I mentioned this book to you all last week. It is a book that has nothing in it but lynching photos. It is a thick book. It is a book that is troubling, to say the least. However, it is a necessary book. At least I'm of the opinion that it's necessary to have in one's library to understand a very critical part of our history, which is part and parcel of what leads to the thing called the Black Wall Street. Senator Landrieu and Senator Allen came across this book, and through it, they became aware of the lynchings that have been happening in America from roughly the end of the Civil War all the way up to the middle of the 20th century. And if you include James Byrd, who was dragged down a Texas road in 1996 behind a pickup truck until his body was severed in half because of being scraped along the pavement, you might say at the end of the 20th century. But what was the big deal with the book and Jim Cameron? Why celebrate James Cameron on June 13, 2005? Well, Senator Landrieu and Senator Allen decided to go ahead and bring Dr. Cameron to the Senate. And it wasn't because he had founded the Black Holocaust Museum, although he did. Sometime, I believe in the 1970s, Dr. Cameron went to the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and bought a building that wasn't being used. And the city sold it to him for $1. And he established something called the America's Black Holocaust Museum. That's where it used to be. Like so many other things that happened in 2020, the museum had to leave its location, shut down, and everything was moved online because of the pandemic. But this is a picture of Dr. Cameron while he was still in the museum. He dedicated his life to building this thing. And it did eventually become a place where school children and other people in the Milwaukee area went to visit the story of what happened to African Americans in the United States. Dr. Cameron got the idea for a Black Holocaust Museum after a trip that he took to Israel with his wife, and he saw memorials and other sites and museums dedicated to the memory or commemorating the Holocaust that the Jews suffered during World War II under the diabolical Nazis. And he had the idea that the same thing that should happen in America for African Americans. But Senator Allen and Senator Landrieu were not celebrating him for that. Was it because he had written a book called A Time of Terror, which talked about the night that the mob tried to lynch him? No. While that book is very informative and it was something that he had to write in 1994, Senator Landrieu and Senator Allen were not celebrating Dr. Cameron for that. Senator Allen and Senator Landrieu brought James Cameron to the United States Senate on June 13, 2005 to get an apology, where the Senate issued an apology. Bear with me as I read from the NBC News report. The Senate late Monday formally apologized for having rejected decades of pleas to make lynching a federal crime as scores of victims' descendants watched from the chamber's gallery. On a voice vote and without opposition, the Senate passed a resolution expressing its regret to the relatives as well as to the nearly 5,000 Americans who were documented as having been lynched from 1880 to 1960. These deaths occurred without trials, mostly in the South, often with the knowledge of local officials who allowed mob lynchings to become picture-taking public spectacles. From 1880 up until at least 1960, 7 different presidents tried to introduce anti-lynching legislation into the Congress to get it passed, and each time it was sent to a quick death in the Senate. 7 times. Now, when what people call the world's greatest deliberative body, the Senate, and if you expand that to the Congress, can I find the wherewithal to pass legislation that can then be turned into law to protect people from mobs that are going around lynching members of their community that are culturally picture-taking public spectacles? I really don't know what other more of a crystalline, clarified definition of tyranny one can have. You have a community of people, a segment of the population that's living with the daily knowledge that this can happen, and there's no law against it, telling the other part of the community that they can lynch folk, get away with it, and nothing will be done, just as happens in a situation where governments are practicing tyranny. If you look at the lynchings that occurred in the South, they're concentrated in the South, from this map from the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics, take a look at this. The Senate measure passed Monday apologized for its failure to pass anti-lynching legislation well into the 20th century. And you can see that the more heavily colored states are, of course, many of the former Confederate states, but please note that Indiana has some pretty dark shading to it as well. In the 1920s, in the decade of the 1920s, Indiana had the largest number, the most active numbers of Ku Klux Klansmen in the entire nation. And by the way, Michigan had a significant presence as well. Michigan had an offshoot of something called the Black Legion. The Black Legion was founded in Southern Ohio by a dentist who thought that the Ku Klux Klan was not radical enough in its harassment of Catholics, Jews, Black people, or anybody else that they thought was unfit to share in the benefits and the glories of the United States. The article goes on to say that some 4,743 people were killed by mob violence between 1882 and 1968, according to Tuskegee University records. Of those, nearly 3/4, that is 3,446, were African Americans. Lynchings reached a peak of 230 in 1892, but they were prevalent well into the 1930s. 20 lynchings alone occurred in 1935. That comes out to roughly more than 1 a month. During that time, nearly 200 anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress and 3 passed the House. 7 presidents between 1890 and 1952 petitioned Congress to pass a federal law. I said seven different laws, but 7 different presidents tried to get anti-lynching legislation in the Congress, and it failed each time. So even presidents with all their power could not do it. Now, scholars have asked, if people are being lynched through vigilante mob justice, and the Congress doesn't see that being a big enough problem to even pass legislation about it. Never mind if they're going to pass legislation and then generate laws and then be serious about enforcing them. Never mind that part. That's part 2. They can't even pass the legislation. What do you think? A community like Tulsa, Oklahoma, what kind of atmosphere? What was the context? How are they living as part of a community in a state, as part of a nation, where people could be lynched and the Ku Klux Klan can march down Pennsylvania Avenue in the 1920s, and the highest deliberative body in the land didn't see it as being a big enough problem to even put ink to paper to make it illegal. The phrase sitting ducks comes to mind. So when you think about that, the citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma in June 1921, May 31st through June 1921, they were not sitting on something that could happen. They were sitting on a thing that was going to happen. It would have been more unusual if it didn't happen. And as we established last week, Tulsa wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a one-off. It wasn't an unusual, unique thing. It was just one of many. It was the worst of one of many, but it was just one of many such incidents that happened. And it's because of the overall environment of this. It is too easy to say that the Congress didn't care. Of course it didn't care. And it's too easy to say that, yes, the Congress at the time was dominated, or at least a lot of the opposition to these anti-lynching laws or anything supporting civil rights, because of Southern Democrats. We all know, you all are informed enough to know that the political parties had gone through several evolutions, and that the Republican Party of Lincoln is not the Republican Party that we have today. The Democratic Party that we have today is not the Democratic Party of the Old South. But at that time, the Democratic Party dominated by Southerners, Dixiecrats, as they would eventually call themselves, made sure to put up a stone wall to make sure that power held by those they thought deserved it would be unchanged. So there you had it. The Senate, with Southern conservatives wielding their filibuster power, there's that word again, refused to act. With the enactment of civil rights laws in the 1960s and changes in national attitudes, the issue faded away. So the attempts to pass anti-lynching legislation never made it to the floor of the Congress and still has not been adopted. To my knowledge, the latest attempt to pass an anti-lynching law was stonewalled, was slain by the opposition of Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. Such legislation would have made lynching a federal crime and allowed the US government to prosecute those responsible, including local law enforcement officials. As we have seen, as has been demonstrated by the record, local law enforcement officials in places like Memphis in 1866, or in East St. Louis, as we'll see in just a moment, or in Tulsa in 1921, either stood by doing nothing, looked the other way while the mobs had their way, or were part of the mob. So this is what I mean about a tolerance for tyranny and accommodation for tyranny, making a space for tyranny inside of our democracy. It was there. And the larger community was absolutely confident that they could literally commit murder and get away with it. And they did it again and again and again and again. So Dr. Cameron was wheeled in. He was very frail at 88 years old. You see Senator Landrieu here. They gave him the mic. And when this happened, I was so happy because you see Senator Landrieu there and Senator Allen. You know, it's good to see a Republican and a Democrat, you know, working together on this. And Dr. Cameron, the only man who ever survived the lynching in America, got the mic and was able to respond to it. Dr. Cameron told the story that when he was released by that mob on August 7, 1930, in later years afterward, he said that when they put the rope around his neck, he was praying so hard, asking God to please have these people let him go. And he said he heard a voice saying, "Let this boy go." And he said that the mob seemed like they were just struck dumb, like in a trance. Now, people said to Dr. Cameron, "Well, I don't really believe that. That sounds weird." Dr. Cameron's response was classic Dr. Cameron. He said, "You know, for people who believe in God, no explanation is required. And for those who don't, it doesn't matter anyway." So he didn't waste his time trying to convince people that his story was true. He knew what happened. He was there, and people could take it or leave it, but either way, he survived and died a natural death. And he is gone to be with his ancestors now. But why him? Why him after all this time? Well, you know, if you think about it, Dr. Cameron did survive, but why him? Why recognize him? He wasn't the only one. He has not been the only one, because think about it. Yeah, what happened to Dr. Cameron occurred in 1930, but we need to remember that there was a young man named Amadou Diallo in 1999 who was shot 41 times by the New York City police. This is his mother, Kadiatou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was an African immigrant who they thought, and the New York City police were pursuing a criminal who I guess was a black man. They asked him for his ID. He went to pull his wallet out, and they put 41 bullets into him, as in 41 bullets. And then there's the case of Coretta Scott King. Her husband, of course, was shot down on April 4th, 1968. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And before him, there was Emmett Till. This is Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett Till's mother. Emmett Till also lynched, and the people that killed him never did any time, were never held to account. In fact, the two men that killed Emmett Till gave an interview a few weeks after the trial, after they were acquitted after less than 1 hour of deliberation. They admitted to William Bradford Hewitt that they did it, and still nothing happened. And the woman who accused Emmett Till of saying something to her, Carolyn Bryant, it's been said that she later has said that he didn't really say anything to her. And then before Emmett Till, there was, of course, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street. This is why I say it's a legacy of Tulsa, not the event of Tulsa. The newspaper said it was the worst race riot in history of the country, about over. Casualties include about 25 whites killed, 100 injured, 60 colored killed, 100 in the street, whole colored section burned. Why did it happen at all? Well, we have mentioned that the lies that were building up to sustain that kind of hatred, fear, and bigotry. The lies about Dick Rowland and what he did that day on the elevator to that young lady, allegedly what he said or did. And then the lies about Black people being dangerous, the lies about Black criminality, the lies about Black stupidity, the lies about Black laziness. All these things fed into a general narrative as, if you think of ingredients into a recipe for a national disaster, all of these things that are flowing into this recipe into a country that can't find the wherewithal to pass laws to protect people from lynch mobs. This is, you're always walking a knife edge. You're always walking a nice edge. For example,
you closed the garage.
We mentioned that what happened in Center, Texas, the year before, anti-lynching law would have helped this guy hanging from the tree. And just like in Marion, Indiana, these people, and tragically, these young people, the gentleman who is laughing in the background, they are living in a country, their community is a community that absolutely knows their Congress is not going to pass any kind of federal law to make lynching a crime. And since no one's going to be held accountable, they feel entitled, not just empowered, but entitled. In fact, for them, they see it as their right, their duty to take action every now and then just to make sure that everything is kept in place and that people understand. That picture of the Center tragedy in Texas there, in Center, Texas, that was the lynching of Lee Daniels, August 3rd, 1920. And just wanted to add this as well. During that lynching, or afterward, a picture was taken, and a postcard was sent to the mail. This was made in the courtyard in Center, Texas. He was a 16-year-old black boy. He killed Earl's grandma. She was Florence's mother. Give this to Bert from Aunt Myrtle. Think about that, Hat Scholars. Once upon a time inside the United States, you could send a picture postcard through the mail of a lynched individual, and somebody at the postal service, the postal worker, will look at it, put it in the sorter or whatever they use, and send it right on its way. It was so normalized. It was so part of the routine. People would even blink. Not even an eyebrow would be raised, because that's just the way it was. We know that today, if a postal worker found, for example, let's say, material that was from being sent to the mail from a pedophile, that individual will be tracked down and hunted and found and imprisoned, because we have got enough sense that in telling ourselves as a national community, we do not tolerate that. People are preying upon our children. However, in 1920, sending a postcard of a lynched man through the mail was considered acceptable. And then there was this thing about the dogwood tree from Sabine County, Texas, June 15th, 1908. I won't show the lynching that occurred in Sabine, Texas, but there was a poem written about it. And it said, "This is the only branch of the dogwood tree, an emblem of white supremacy, a lesson once taught in the pioneer school. This is a land of white man's rule. The red man once, in an early day, was told by the whites to mend his way. The Negro now, by eternal grace, must learn to stay in the Negro's place. In the sunny South, the land of the free, let the white supreme forever be. Let this a warning to all Negroes be, or they'll suffer the fate of the dogwood tree." Sabine County, Texas, June 15th, 1908, 13 years before the Black Wall Street. Is it coming through? How the Black Wall Street was more a situation of how could it not happen than how could it not have happened. So murder, when you can murder people with no consequences, with no accountability, with no inquiry, with no interest, to kill a black person is no more, doesn't cause any more of a stir than hitting a deer on the road or running over a dog or putting down a wounded animal. When people's lives are devalued and dehumanized like that, the Black Wall Street was a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the right match to be put to the fuse. And again, we had to ask the people who did these things, who did they think African Americans were? Who did they think they were? What was going on in the society at that time that drove them or that led them to conclude that they could do such a thing? I've been trying to address that. How did they get there? The entire trajectory of our history explains that. And why did they do it again and again and again? But I suspect that the answer to why is tied up in the first three: who they thought they were, what was going on, and how we got there in the first place. What happened, what led to the Wall Street tragedy of 1921 and so many other tragedies similar to it before and then after, was because of a thing that I refer to as a culture of impunity. What won't people do when they know that they won't have to suffer any consequences for it? Think of Kristallnacht in November 1938, I believe it was November 1938, the night of broken glass, when Nazi thugs went throughout Germany, burning Jewish synagogues, burning and looting Jewish businesses, and attacking Jews in the street. And they did that because they knew that nobody would lift a finger, and indeed nobody did lift a finger. What can't happen when a group of people are targeted over and over again, and the national culture says it's okay, they don't matter, they're not protected by the law? Where does it stop? Where does the terror end in a culture of impunity? When people are absolutely guaranteed, in the case of Memphis or East St. Louis or Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Rosewood, or Emmett Till, or Amadou Diallo, that you will not absolutely have to answer to no one for killing these Black people. One piece of information that I found relative to this culture of impunity says that when you have a culture of impunity, it can take many forms. All of them. In a culture of impunity, you silence free expression, freedom of speech. In a culture of impunity, it says societally, it fosters a climate of fear, apathy, and suspicion, where individuals are afraid to talk about the issues that affect their communities and societies at large. The result, an ill-informed society resigned to the status quo. If there's anything that happened after the Tulsa race riot, it was the fact that for the next 100 years, no one spoke about it. Black folks talked about it, but they didn't talk about it out loud for fear of reprisal. And the white citizens of Tulsa did not talk about it because, after all, their Black Tulsan neighbors didn't matter. And how do they know that? Because nationally, they didn't matter. Nationally, a culture of impunity is a weak rule of law, and the failure of national institutions are at the root of a culture of impunity. In a country with pervasive corruption, unchecked state power, and an ineffective judicial system, justice cannot be served. When it came to African Americans in America, the justice system, whatever could be said about it, was not functioning for them. Not in 1921. Impunity defined by this particular website, ifex.org. When someone acts with impunity, it means that their actions have no consequences. Threats, attacks, murders all go unpunished. A culture of impunity exists when those who deny others their right to freedom of expression can do so knowing it is unlikely that they will be held accountable for their actions. Within a culture of impunity, a chilling effect on the free flow of ideas and information takes hold. This culture strips people of their ability to fully participate in a societal decision-making, an essential element of a healthy democracy. Participating, through things called the vote. The vote, a form of free expression, a form of freedom of speech. These actions in a culture of impunity were designed to remind African Americans over and over and over again. The best example that comes to mind right now is Fannie Lou Hamer, who in the 1960s was working as a sharecropper in Mississippi. This Black woman in the middle of the 20th century did not even realize that she had the right to vote. Why? Because it was in the interest of the local authorities in Mississippi for her and other Black people not to vote. Why? Because it was a matter of power and hanging on to power. So you couldn't really have democracy with Black people participating in it if the ruling class in Mississippi wanted to have democracy run in a way that it would always benefit them. The risk that people might vote their own interest the other way was not going to be allowed. Tyranny. In 1903, in a chilling forecast of what would happen later on in the 20th century, the brilliant historian, sociologist, activist, eventual co-founder, one of the many founders of something called the Niagara Movement. For those of you who are interested in such things, if you're taking notes, the Niagara Movement of 1915 was a movement that literally met at Niagara Falls and eventually became the NAACP. And one individual who was part of that was this man right here, Dr. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. He never saw a day in slavery, but he grew up in a deeply divided, racially segregated, racial apartheid called the United States. Dr. Du Bois, probably his most famous work is what I have displayed here, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. And in the early chapters of that book, Dr. Du Bois said the following: The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia, Africa, and America, and the islands of the sea. This is 1903. 1903, he's saying this. It was a phase of this problem, the color line, that caused the Civil War, and however much they who marched south and north in 1861 may have fixed on the technical points of union, watch this, and local autonomy as a shibboleth, all nevertheless knew, as we know, that the question of Negro slavery was the real cause of the conflict. The history of the American Negro is a history of strife, this longing to attain self-consciousness, self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. 1903, he's writing this. 18 years before Tulsa. 27 years before the attempted lynching of Dr. James Cameron. Dr. Du Bois's prediction about problems, as shown from this map, were all too grimly true. Take a look at it. Black massacres that occurred in Memphis, 1866, Vicksburg, 1874, Slocum, 1910, Colfax, 1873, Opelousas, 1868, Thibodaux, 1887, St. Bernard Parish, 1868, New Orleans, 1866, Elaine, 1919, Clinton, 1875, Atlanta, 1906, Philadelphia, 1985, Washington, 1919, Wilmington, 1898, Ocoee in 1920, Afala, 1874, Camilla, 1868, Springfield, 1908, Chicago, 1919. And scholars of HASP, I got to tell you, this is not a complete map. This is just showing a map of some of the really big ones. This is not all inclusive. But what I want to do for a moment is focus upon one that occurred during World War I. Now, World War I, of course, starts in 1914, 7 years before what happens to the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And as you know, the United States gets involved in World War I on April 6, 1917. President Woodrow Wilson, the person that I said has to be one of the worst presidents when it comes to their record on race relations in the 20th century. On April 6, 1917, he went before the Congress, outlined the United States reasons for having differences with Germany, asked for a declaration of war, and got it. So America goes to World War I in 1917, and African-American soldiers sign up in large numbers. They signed up for the same reason they signed up in the Spanish-American War. They signed up for the same reason they signed up for the Philippine insurrection. They signed up for the same reason they signed up during the Civil War. They signed up for the same reason they fought in the American Revolution. Maybe if we literally put our necks on the line and fight for the freedom and liberty and opportunity that Americans say they love so much, we will prove to them that A, we are worthy of our citizenship. We will prove to them that we are courageous. We will prove that we have earned the right to full citizenship, all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities. Rights, privileges, and responsibilities as full-fledged, first-class American citizens. And so they go to Europe to fight against German militarism. And they fight well. They get decorated. They fight bravely. But yet, in 1917, in East St. Louis, 1917, in the year that America goes to war to fight for democracy, you know, the war to end all wars, In 1917, East St. Louis erupts in racial tension where a white mob in 1917 goes through the Black community in East St. Louis on the basis of rumors, conspiracy, and lies. I have been trying to emphasize that lies aren't just lies. Lies are dangerous because people who decide to act on a lie, those people are dangerous. Which is why I keep telling people, I keep on saying, you know, when we're hearing about the big lie right now, we should really be paying attention to that. Because when people decide to act on a lie, that's when the lie becomes something different. Then it becomes violence. It becomes a mob action. In 1917, that mob action saw something very, very tragic happen in East St. Louis. Let's take a look at this brief video.
East St. Louis back then was an industrial boom town with all kinds of conflicts and tensions between ethnic and political groups, between workers, companies, unions. There were plenty of jobs. When World War I cut off the flow of immigrants from Eastern Europe, companies went to the American South for a fresh supply of cheap, unskilled labor. And now these northern industrial cities had a new issue to deal with, something they called the Negro problem. Like the Eastern Europeans before them, African Americans now left home to find work and to start new lives in northern industrial cities. And they heard that if you couldn't get a job in East St. Louis, you couldn't get a job anywhere. There had always been African Americans living in the American bottoms, but their numbers were relatively small until now. You could see it every day at the East St. Louis train station, the new arrivals from the South coming in such numbers that they were becoming more visible in town, in the factories, and in politics. These were loyal Lincoln Republicans, anxious to vote, and Republican Party leaders were anxious to get them registered.
It upsets the political balance in the first couple of decades, especially in that second decade. And there's lots of talk, especially in the teens, about voter fraud.
The charges came from the Democrats, and during Woodrow Wilson's 1916 re-election campaign, the Justice Department investigated what was being called colonization, an alleged conspiracy to import blacks to steal elections in northern cities. One story, unsupported by evidence but widely circulated, was a plot to have blacks vote in East St. Louis, then board a train to vote in Springfield, and a third time in Chicago.
If you take the newspapers at face value, you would say the public perception was, oh yes, there was colonization. But when you start digging through the testimonies, people knew it wasn't that at all. Black folks were trickling into the city. World War I opened the floodgates. They were coming anyway for jobs, and the contemporaries knew that.
But people were being told they were here to steal elections. Labor leaders said they were here to steal jobs. And the huge numbers of newcomers were straining the local housing and services. Racial tensions continued to grow. It's not that the country was ever really at peace with itself in this era. There were race riots and labor battles like these in other cities before and after. But what happened in East St. Louis struck a national nerve. The reports of Americans killing Americans came on the same front pages as the reports of American troops in Europe fighting to save democracy. It was labor troubles at the aluminum ore plant that set the tragic events in motion. The company followed its usual practice of bringing in replacement workers to break the strikes and keep the plant in operation. But now many of the replacements were Negroes. There were white replacements too, but strike leaders made blacks the issue and the target.
It becomes so conflated with racial animosity too. It's the way that you can organize people and organize a mob. That's what they did.
In the spring of 1917, the National Guard was brought in to protect the factory and its workers. But everybody knew this was a town on the verge of a race riot. When violence flared up in May, the Guard was able to keep it under control. But East St. Louis hadn't cooled off. Tensions built. fueled by unsubstantiated press reports of Negro crime waves and gun purchases, and by rumors and inflammatory public speeches.
They wanted to drive the blacks out of East St. Louis. They wanted to make East St. Louis an all-white town.
The evening of Sunday, July 1st, a car drove through a Negro neighborhood firing shots as it drove by. Later, when another car approached, shots were fired from the crowd. Maybe some thought it was the same car, but it wasn't. Police officers were in this one and 2 were killed. When word of what happened spread, white mobs set out to attack blacks. They beat, shot, lynched, even burned to death. Fires were set in black neighborhoods and people were shot as they tried to escape the flames. A family just up from Mississippi stepped right into the middle of it.
And just as we got to 10th Street, where we were standing, we could see different people running and hollering, colored people. And they were getting down in the weeds that they were hiding from. And the guy was running and shooting. You didn't know what to shoot. You just see the smoke and hear the shot.
That was a scary time.
The daughter of former Mayor Melbourne Stevens was told to stay indoors, and she watched from her bedroom window.
You could hear cars racing by and people yelling and screaming. And I could see all the fires burning. Where they'd set fire, to the colored houses. I was petrified.
No one will ever know for sure how many people were killed in the East St. Louis race riot of 1917. Some of the early reports were exaggerated. The official death toll was 39 blacks and 9 whites. Others accepted the higher number of 100, almost all black. They searched for bodies, but so many people couldn't be accounted for. Maybe they had crossed the bridge to St. Louis. Maybe their bodies were somewhere in the river. The nation responded with speeches, editorials, and accusations. Some blamed labor, the police, city government, industry for importing blacks. Some said whites had only acted to prevent a black uprising. In the South, many said the race riot exposed Northern hypocrisy and showed what was really awaiting Southern blacks in northern cities.
By the 19-teens, it was the North's turn to decide on the Negro question. And I see East St. Louis as a harbinger of white supremacy, Northern style.
Despite pressures from blacks and whites to condemn the riot, President Wilson made no statement. But Congress investigated the riot, the crimes, and the city of East St. Louis itself. This wasn't a black eye. This was a self-inflicted wound that would leave an ugly scar, if it ever healed at all.
Scholars will have what you heard in that video, several things to take note of. You heard early in the video that there were rumors of voter fraud. Heard that story before? You also heard that there were conspiracy theories about black people being taken by train from one town to another to vote 1, 2, 3 times. You also heard that people committed arson, looting, lynching, burning people alive. You heard that the National Guard was called in. You heard that people were put into a mass grave. All these things would happen 4 years later in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You heard also that the Congress investigated and speeches were made and people were thumping their chests and talking about how awful it was, and yet nothing happened. As again would happen in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So East St. Louis is a harbinger of what's going to happen. At the time, it was the worst, one of the worst race riots in the United States. And Tulsa will overshadow it. Dr. Du Bois, in response to what happened in East St. Louis, W.B. Du Bois, speaking about the contributions of African Americans fighting in Europe at the time, he said, "We are cowards and jackasses if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return, soldiers from Europe. We return from fighting. We return from fighting and we return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States or know the reason why." What you're gonna have in Tulsa, Oklahoma is a new generation of Black men, Black people who have gone to Europe to fight for democracy, have not found it at home, and that will not be good enough. That will not be acceptable. They will fight back. And for a nation that has a culture of impunity, where tyranny can exist in certain communities as a rule, where lynching and looting and arson and bombing and raping and pillaging and plundering is normative and no one's held accountable. When people from that community decide to fight back, the larger community that has been conditioned to see itself as empowered and entitled to do whatever it wants, they become even further enraged because now they have to do all the more to keep the status quo. After East St. Louis, of course, came 1919. 1919 was the year of what's called the Red Summer. The Red Summer was the summer of 1919 saw a national racial frenzy, clashes, massacres, and lynchings throughout the North and the South. All were started by whites. There's a book entitled Red Summer, which I recommend you all getting. Let me just share with you, just bear with me as I read from this. The Red Summer refers to the summer and fall of 1919 in which race riots exploded in a number of cities in both the North and the South. The three most violent episodes occurred in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Elaine, Arkansas. On the afternoon of July 27, 1919, a stone-throwing melee between Blacks and whites began after a Black youth mistakenly swam into territory claimed by whites off the 29th Street beach in Chicago. A Black child swam in the wrong part of Lake Michigan. Amidst the mayhem, Eugene Williams, the Black child, was hit by a rock and drowned. When a white police officer refused to arrest the white men involved in the death, and instead arrested a Black man. So white men throwing rocks at a Black kid in Lake Michigan, hit the kid, he drowns, a Black man gets arrested. When people protested that, fighting broke out between gangs and mobs of both races. Violence escalated with each incident, and for 13 days, Chicago was in a state of turmoil. By the time the riot ended, 23 Blacks and 15 whites were dead, 537 injured, and 1,000 Black families left homeless, just as occurred in East St. Louis, and just as would occur a year and a half, 2 years later in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the Chicago riot was part of a national racial frenzy of clashes, massacres, and lynchings. Clashes, massacres, and lynchings throughout the North and the South. Not just the South, the North and the South. Clashes, massacres, lynchings. At what point in American history is it appropriate to use the word massacre? All of the incidents were initiated by whites, according to 13.org. Now, 13.org, if you're interested in such things, is a website that looks at the history of Jim Crow. It is 13.org. In Washington, D.C., from July 19th through July 23rd, 4 whites and 2 blacks were killed. Whites were astonished that blacks dared to fight back. I read again, whites were astonished that blacks were daring to fight back. This was an era of a type of culture that was referred to as the New Negro. On the cusp of the very beginning of what became the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro was supposed to be more educated, more urbane, more vocal, more bold in expressing the desire for civil rights and to participate as a full-fledged first-class citizen in this constitutional democratic republic. The New York Times lamented the new black militancy. There had been no trouble with the Negro before the war when most admitted the superiority of the white race. A Southern black woman, as she identified herself, wrote a letter to The Crisis. Now, The Crisis magazine was the lead at the time, and The Crisis is still being published, but The Crisis was just this, let's just call it the magazine of the NAACP. So a black woman wrote to The Crisis magazine, published by the NAACP, and for a long time, Dr. Du Bois was the editor of The Crisis, and she wrote a letter to The Crisis praising blacks for fighting back. The Washington riot, she said, gave me a thrill that comes once in a lifetime. At last, our men had stood up like men. I stood up alone in my room and exclaimed aloud, "Oh, I thank God, thank God." The pent-up horror, grief, and humiliation of a lifetime, half a century was being stripped from me. Scholars have asked, in the spring of 2020, in the first half of that year when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and then all the people took to the streets, and then there was that young man who went into Wisconsin, I believe, and shot 2 people during the demonstration, and he was hailed as a vigilante hero. I got a lot of calls from people and a lot of discussions with people asking, where is this coming from? Why is this all happening right now? And the answer, I believe, partly, if not completely, lies in the statement of this black woman who wrote to The Crisis in 1919. She said, "Oh, I thank God, I thank God." The pent-up horror, grief, and humiliation of a lifetime. Think of an entire community of people that, at least in this woman's case, she says, I've been living with this for a lifetime. It's just been getting pent up in me. She's been sitting on this building powder keg of frustration and humiliation, horror, grief, and humiliation. And in 1919, people said, I'm not taking it anymore. And when they said they're not taking it anymore, people were surprised that they were fighting back. And then they got angry about it. How dare you fight back? Don't worry, we'll fix this to put you back in your place. So riots swept Chicago. Riots swept throughout the nation. And again, there was a pattern of murder and violence with no consequences. They did it because they could. Well, we have to ask this question. What are the consequences of having no consequences? You know, every parent recognizes that when their child does something that is not to their desires, not to their wishes, particularly if the child's done something that could be in violation of the law, we get upset, we get excited, we get fearful for our children because we understand that we live in a society where consequences, they exist. But what happens if there are no consequences? What kind of society does that produce? Or if there are no consequences for murdering a person or lynching a person or lynching an entire community, what are the consequences of that? And I ask this question again because it's the question that I put to the students in my slavery and race class. We know the story is all too easy to talk about what happened to the Black people in East St. Louis. It's too easy to know what happened to the Black people in Memphis in 1866, or in Colfax, or in Chicago in 1919, or what happened in 1921 in Tulsa. The story is tragic, it is grim, it is unjust, it is all these things, but we understand what happens to the Black people. But what happens to a nation and a society where this happens and there are no consequences? What happens to the people who are the perpetrators of this? Because rest assured, they're impacted. It may not be visible, but something does happen. What happens to the law? What happens to that society? What happens to its cultural norms? What kind of society is it? What are the consequences of no consequences? Psalm 13, 1 through 2, verses 1 through 2. In the words of the psalmist, he asks, "How long, O Lord, wilt thou forget me in forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" The legacy of the Black Wall Street was happening long before the Black Wall Street tragedy occurred. It was already a tragic situation in the United States. And by 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma will not become the largest. It will be the worst, of course. But by 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma will simply become the latest of a string of mob actions where one part of the community goes pillaging, plundering, and rampaging through another part of the community, because that part of the community that's getting pillaged and plundered, they simply are not seen as first-class citizens. They're not protected by the law. They're not respected. They're living in a situation of de facto tyranny, even if it's not actually recognized as such. They have no freedom of speech. They have no real freedom of movement. They don't even have the freedom to succeed under a grossly unjust system called Jim Crow that they have been forced to live in on the margins. So even when they live inside of that margin and succeed within it, that to them becomes a violation, because the whole goal was never for them to succeed, but for them to be in the margin, quiet, invisible, and if necessary, to be fodder for being murdered, lynched, pillaged, and plundered at will. In a society of no consequences that was driven by a culture of impunity. So they did these things because they could do these things. So this takes us to the threshold now of Tulsa. Next week, we will finally talk about Tulsa, and it will not come as any surprise about why Tulsa occurred, how it could have occurred. You'll see that Tulsa was just a continual unfolding of this larger tragic narrative of white mobs going into Black communities and setting them afire, or in Tulsa's case, literally bombing them from the air and nothing being done. Tulsa is an event that in itself occurred because of a legacy of a culture of impunity, where people did these things because they could, and then they did them again because they could, and there were no consequences, which reinforced the message that they could do it and get away with it. So they did it again and again and again and again. I'll take your questions now.
Okay, good morning. I only have one in the chat. so far, and it's just wanting to clarify whether it was the case or not that all 50 states did have state laws against murder during those years, but that they were often not enforced. Technically, it was not legal to lynch people anywhere during this time. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I don't think, Kim, that there were any states that had laws where lynch law was part of the state's legal statutes. So it was always vigilante mob justice. And yes, I believe that every state had laws on the books against murder. But just as the question indicates, it's a question of just how, well, I always say this, a law is only as good as the enforcement mechanism behind it. You can have a law, but if you're not going to enforce the law, you may as well not have the law.
Well, and do you think that they would have like differentiated between like murder versus lynching, even though a lynch could be a murder?
Well,
was that their way of getting around it, do you think?
I think the way of getting around it was the question of who's being lynched. You can lynch somebody, but if you're lynching a Black person, well, is that really a crime?
Right.
In the society of that day? I mean, it should be.
Right.
But if a state or communities decided that Black people can't be murdered, or that to murder a Black person doesn't come with any consequences, this is if the society, if the community decides that murdering a black person has no consequences, then you can believe that the Black people of that community, they'll get the message. Their lives are worthless.
Yeah.
Because it's been demonstrated. And the other people will also get the message that because Black lives are worthless, you can lynch someone, murder them, and bear no consequences for it. For a good part of America's early history, it was literally impossible to accuse or for a person to be charged with raping a Black woman.
Right.
Why? It's because there were no laws against it. Doesn't mean that Black women weren't raped. Absolutely not. Black women were raped on a repeated serial basis. But if a Black woman is not seen as a full-blown human being deserving of the kind of respect that other people get, you can't rape her, even though you do rape her, but legally, there's no consequences for it. So therefore, it happened again and again and again.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, a couple more from Anne. Do you believe we are currently living in a culture of impunity?
Yes.
I think that our culture has shifted to where there's a growing possibility of accountability. Derek Chauvin's recent conviction shows that. And I think more people are being more thoughtful about what they do because of recent events that have been happening, demanding accountability. But there are still things happening. The thing that concerns me the most right now is what I mentioned during the two presentations: the big lying, and people's willingness to believe the lie, and more than that, people's willingness to act on the lie, because that will feed what has been a culture of impunity.
Thank you. Then there's a person asking if you would give a plug for Brian Jackson's new monument in Montgomery, recording all of the lynchings. I'm not familiar with that, but.
I am not familiar with that, but I will take a look at it.
Okay.
Once I learn more about it, then I will be happy to give it a plug.
Okay. And then a question from Linda: why is a statue of Roger Taney still the only sacred statue in the robing room of the U.S. House of Representatives? And there's no move to replace this statue has yet succeeded. Comments, question.
Roger B. Taney, former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the presiding Chief Justice in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. And Roger Brooke Taney, of course, wrote the majority opinion of the court in 1857, in which he stated that when it came to, speaking of Dred Scott, who lived for a good part of his time in Missouri, a slave state, and was taken to Wisconsin. I think at the time, Wisconsin was a territory. And since Wisconsin would eventually become a free state, as a territory, it didn't even have the legitimacy of being a slave state or a free state. So technically, if you're thinking about if Dred Scott had run from Missouri to Wisconsin or Canada, he would have been practically free. But he was taken to Wisconsin, then brought back to Missouri, and some people got together and took his case to court to decide that issue. And when it came to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Taney said that not only was Dred Scott a slave, but people like him had been slaves, considered property at the founding of the Republic. And look, this is repugnant, repulsive legal analysis. However, as far as a matter of law, Justice Taney wasn't wrong historically when he said at the founding of the Republic, people who looked like Dred Scott were considered property, and in 1857 they still were. So therefore, property can't sue its owner in court. However, since it did come before the court, it was deemed that Dred Scott was still property. There was nothing compelling in the argument for Dred Scott that would move the court to change its mind. And he added this little notion there too. He said, there's nothing concerning a black man that a white man is bound to respect anyway. So Roger B. Taney has an infamous history. He's from the state of Maryland, I believe. And I do not know why the statue's still there. However, I would say this. I'm not sure exactly how helpful it is to remove Confederate statues or people that we don't like, because for the same reason that I have pictures of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson on my desk in my office, in addition to Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and people from the North, because this is American history, and we do not do ourselves, I think we don't do ourselves a favor at all by saying, we don't like that part, so let's not talk about it.
Right.
Not talking about it is
Right.
the problem now. So I think that
Right.
when it comes to the Confederate statues, if you have a Confederate statue in, I don't know, New Orleans, put a chain around the thing and a plaque that goes, this statue was erected in 1925, not to celebrate the Old South, but because Black people protesting for civil rights that year were trying to get civil rights for themselves, and the blah, blah, blah organization put this up and was borrowing the legacy of the Old South that never really existed anyway, the legacy, to send a message to them in 1925. Because one of the things that Robert E. Lee said after the Civil War was that he didn't want any statues erected to himself. He had fought a war against his country and lost, and just wanted to put it behind him. Robert E. Lee understood that the best thing America could do was to get on with trying to unify itself. That's not to deify Robert E. Lee. It's not to absolve him of fighting against his country or violating the Constitution. But if we're going to talk about this stuff, we got to talk about it in full blast. And we cannot be so fragile when it comes to talking about the ugly history, so that we don't talk about it. Because if we don't do that, we will continue getting surprised again and again and again.
Yeah.
That's a
Are
good
you
idea.
aware that the House has passed legislation to take away those statues in the Capitol?
I'm sorry, who am I talking to?
Al Minor.
Say that again, Al?
The House of Representatives has passed legislation to take away those statues in the US Congress that they deem racist, or including Roger.
I'm gonna tell you, I think that is the House doing something that is beside the point. If they really want to get my attention, how about forming that bipartisan commission to look at the insurrection of January 6th? That's what they ought to be doing.
Yeah, true.
Because on January 6th, the entire Civil War was fought for 4 years, And the Confederates got only to within maybe 7 miles of the Capitol, 7 miles in the summer of 1864, when Robert E. Lee dispatched Jubal Anderson Early to raid Washington as a diversion to ease the pressure that was being placed on Richmond and Fredericksburg and Petersburg by the Union Army. Ulysses S. Grant had to pull back 1-2 Corps back to Washington, which bought Lee some time in his defenses. Jubal Anderson Early did his job. But on January 6th, you guys have seen the picture of that guy walking inside the Capitol, inside the Congress with the Confederate flag. He did something on January 6th that the entire Confederate Army never was able to do. So if they want to do something to capture my attention, leave the statues there, make it a teaching moment, and form that bipartisan commission and get the Senate to stop playing around and do something to reinforce the guardrails that were put in place after the Nixon administration in 1973 and erect some new guardrails, because we have seen that this democracy is a lot weaker than people thought it was.
Amen. Kind of related to that, Jim says, you've shown that these events were predictable based on the state of the country at that time. Given our country today, what should we predict will happen next? Ew.
Well, if people keep on believing the lie about the election, you see, to believe the lie about the election and how it was conducted, it requires a willingness to believe the lie. And that implies the willingness to act on the lie.
And believe other lies.
And believe other lies.
Yeah.
And if people are willing to believe the lie and act on that lie, then that means that you're essentially, speaking of a culture of impunity and no consequences, this also means that the chief perpetrator of the lie will also suffer no consequences.
Yeah.
The chief perpetrator of the lie must be held accountable. And if that doesn't happen, there are people out there who are standing in line to imitate the chief perpetrator, and they're getting the message that it can be done and gotten away with.
Yeah.
We're going to be busy at this for a long time if something's not done. So the state of the country right now, we have people who are willing to believe the lie. There are people who are willing to act on the lie. Think of the siege of the Michigan Capitol in Lansing, and then in Washington, D.C. Clearly, they're willing to take action.
Mm-hmm.
They're willing to subvert democracy, and they're willing to subvert democracy to the exclusion of other people, to exclude other people. That mindset still sees some people worthy of full citizenship and other people who should just be quiet and go along to get along. And as you say, other people that are standing in line to take the place of the chief perpetrator, if there's no accountability, then they will correctly conclude they can do this and get away with it, and it is only likely to escalate. Historians are not supposed to predict things, but I'm just saying, if you're looking at the possibilities of from one logical result to another one and the possibilities to produce, this is what I see.
Okay. Next question is, if you have time, a minute to expand on the lynching bill introduced that Rand Paul voted against, and what year that was, and if there have been any repercussions.
I think that was either 2019 or 2020. And I had to do, I got to look more into it, but when I did look into it, such as I did, he was opposed to it because of something like, well, you know, we need to specify what exactly this is, because the way the bill is written right now, if, you know, a police officer puts handcuffs on somebody, they can say you're trying to lynch me, and that's not correct. So on some, some type of specious logic like that, he held up the legislation. And,
Wow.
you know, it reminded me of what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, so I can get this quote right, Kim, where he said, "There's nothing more dangerous than willful ignorance or conscientious stupidity." And on that case, Rand Paul managed to do something that I didn't think anybody could do. He did both.
Yep.
He was willfully ignorant and conscientiously stupid which is really tragic for a man as well educated and as intelligent as he is. However, intelligence and education doesn't have anything to do with people's willingness to subvert democracy or deny other people's full participation in democracy. But I will continue to look further into that lynching legislation. And I think that at the time, the filibuster was a tool that prevented that legislation from being passed.
Okay.
And people might say, you know, well, do we need anti-lynching legislation in the 21st century?
Yeah.
Well, you know, we never thought the Capitol would be stormed, did we?
They were invited to, sort of. Okay, there's a correction from someone that the monument in Montgomery that was referred to earlier is Brian Stevenson.
Right.
Okay,
Brian Stevenson connected with the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI.
okay.
I will-
And then a couple comments, just that there is a current movement to remove the statue of Taney. The House voted yesterday to replace Confederate leader statues from the Capitol, and that Taney's would be replaced with a bust of Thurgood Marshall. And then just some amens and agreed on your previous comment. So that's that. And then, oh, someone asking you to please say the quote of MLK again. I'm assuming that's the one about willful ignorance.
I think the quote is, there's nothing more dangerous than conscientious willful ignorance or and conscientious stupidity.
It's a good one.
You know, here's the thing, you know, historians and other people are always cautioned, you know, don't compare things to Nazi Germany because, you know, those kind of comparisons have become such a cliche, right? The Nazis are stand-ins for anything evil. Well, yeah, they were evil, but here's one of the things that occurred in the period before the Nazis, Kim. It was called the Weimar Republic. That period from 1919 to 1929.
Okay.
And 1933, when Hitler finally came to power. The one thing the Nazis did, and the one thing that they absolutely had to accomplish in order to achieve their objective of coming to power, the first thing they had to do was they had to achieve the objective of reducing people's confidence in the democracy and democratic processes. In other words, do whatever they could to make sure that the democracy could not function, that it could not deliver on things like, you know, police protection, fire protections, just, you know, the regular everyday stuff. When you turn the lights on, when you flush the toilet, make sure that it couldn't do those kind of things. And so they actively set out to corrupt and weaken the democracy. And it didn't help that Weimar was fundamentally weak anyway, but they wanted to place more strain on it to make sure that the democracy could not work. And that if democracy couldn't work, then that meant that democracy itself was useless. So what do you do if democracy is useless? You choose the next best alternative, the guy that says, choose me, I can fix it. That sounds familiar. So we have to be aware of the fact that there are elements out there who want this democracy to be work. They want us to be divided. They want it to be dysfunctional. It is in their interest to have us at each other's throats. And we have to work double time, triple time, quadruple time to make sure that we're getting along with each other and that we are collectively making the democracy work.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's all I have in the chat. So if anybody else wants to unmute, we have a few minutes left to ask questions or make a comment. Please feel free.
Fred, I have a question for you. You've mentioned President Woodrow Wilson a number of times as you've been talking to us about the legacy of Black Wall Street. What would have been in his background that would have made him completely unresponsive to Black injury and injustice? Do you have you researched that at all that you could share with us?
I think Wilson was a Southerner kid, and he was a member of the Democrat. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson was a member of the Democratic Party. And at the time, the Democratic Party, I mentioned to you all earlier in the presentation that political parties go through evolutions, right? The Democratic Party of today is not the one that was of 1919. The Democratic Party that Woodrow Wilson belonged to was dominated or had significant amount of Southern conservatives who were absolutely committed to keeping Jim Crow in place. So he belonged to that Democratic Party. That's part of his background. I also think that he was a Southerner. I have to double check that. I think he was born as a Southerner, but I have to look further into Woodrow Wilson's background. The thing that makes Woodrow Wilson such a tragic figure when it comes to these kind of issues is because he was an historian and he was a former president of Princeton University.
Right.
So
Mhm.
you think that his credentials,
Yeah,
his
you
background would have elevated him above that. No, we have to remember there was a historian in the early 20th century named, I believe it was Claude Dunning. He put out a bunch of, he taught at Columbia University, and he's known for something called the Dunning School. And in the Dunning School, Professor Dunning summed up Reconstruction like the Civil War like this in Reconstruction, that Reconstruction was a disaster. Black people and Black soldiers in particular were running amok. Crime was on the rise, and social dislocation, and corruption in politics, ballot stuffing, and the South had been wronged egregiously by the Civil War, and Black rule was a fool's errand during Reconstruction. And he put out a number of historians, and these people had careers into the 1950s and 60s in the United States and American universities. And so they were teaching what's called the Dunning School. So it wouldn't be until the latter half of the 1960s, post-civil rights movement, that this entire narrative of the Civil War, and the fact that you could once and for all finally say that, just as Abraham Lincoln said, and like W.B. Du Bois said, it was fought over slavery, which means that race was an issue. Woodrow Wilson and Claude G. Dunning were on the same page of the Dunning School's interpretation of things. So Woodrow Wilson, if I can borrow the phrase from Winston Churchill, on the issue of race, he's an enigma wrapped inside of a mystery, wrapped inside of a riddle. Just generally, an awful human being when it came to this issue. I'm sorry. Who was
No,
saying?
you're fine.
Kim, you got time for one more question?
Yes, please.
In your comment about the January 6th insurrection, in that context, could you comment on ex-President Trump pronouncing himself as the chosen one?
The chosen. Well, let me just to pronounce himself the chosen one is no less ridiculous than the other thousands of ridiculous things that guy has said. Okay?
I agree.
We are a nation, Russ, of, as they used to say, laws and women and men. And I have been banging the drum recently that it's not so much an issue anymore, at least as I see it, it is always about civil rights. But the big issue these days is democracy. We had to fight to save democracy in America. That's what's at stake.
I agree.
I've been telling people because, it doesn't, whatever your pet project is, if it's LGBTQ rights, civil rights, environmental rights, whatever it is, if the democracy goes away, your pet project is going to be backburnered anyway. We must save democracy. That's the first and foremost priority. And so for this individual to be the chosen one, the phrase legend in your own mind comes to mind.
Thank you.
I'm restraining myself because I don't want to have to repent later on for what I
A hard one. Hard. It is 11 o'clock, so I want to respect everyone's time. If you need to go, we understand, but
We have one more session.
yeah.
I have a
Yes.
question, but you can't hear me, I don't think.
No, we can hear you, Kay. Go ahead, hon.
Oh, I have a friend who fought as a Marine for the United States in the 60s and 60s. And he appeared on a beach and was told that he had to get off because they didn't allow Black people. That's not what they said. But I talked to him a lot about how he maintains a positive outlook on life. And when you talk about these horrendous things, it just breaks my heart. And I think, how do you maintain a spirit of seeing the cup half full instead of half empty?
You know, okay, part of it is that when I look at the sacrifices that African Americans have made in the service of the United States, from establishing the economy early in the colonial period, through a cotton economy, that was the nation's foundational wealth. That empowered it to become an industrial power in the late 19th, early 20th century. And African Americans who lost their lives on the battlefield during the Civil War, the American Revolution, 5,000, 186,000 in the Civil War, and then during World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam. So much has been invested in the name of maintaining this democracy. And so I have dedicated myself to saying that before it's my time to check out and leave this realm, this thing is going to work. This democracy is going to work. So people who declare themselves chosen one or not, they don't get to come now and say, well, thanks for all your service and we don't need you anymore. No, it's too late for that. We're going to make this thing work. We're going to get along. We're going to respect each other. We might end up even loving each other. But it must work. It must work because it is worth protecting. And I recognize the fact that people like Thomas Jefferson, could not even live up to his own words in the Declaration of Independence. That's called human flaw and foible. I have my own, but this is going to work. And I guess another part too, Kid, is that I have been privileged enough and blessed enough to travel to other countries, Europe and Africa, to see where democracy isn't working, where people have real problems. And to understand that I have wanted to kiss American soil every time I've gotten back. And I've been to some pretty fantastic countries. But we need to make this thing work. And it's going to.
Thank you. And then we just had the
Well, you're
last comment.
amazing. Thank you.
That we all need to save democracy is the last comment someone put in the chat. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
When are we, I hope that with all the restrictions being lifted, I hope to meet with you all in person real soon.
Yeah, we should in September based on what they're telling us, unless something goes really wrong, but yes.
I miss you
Then
so
we have you one more week next week, right, for this last class?
Yeah.
Yes, the last class will be next Wednesday, and
I'm
Fred is in.
submitting
Yeah, you-
and I outlined to Kim for something called the China Burma India Theater in the fall.
Okay.
That's for the fall. And next week's is, this is a good line that you wrote, just to kind of give us a little preview. Unable to crush the Black communities can do in spite of you spirit. This is in Tulsa. A white mob resorted to the lynch law violence they had come to love. So that is, in a nutshell, what Fred is going to be speaking to us about next week in the third session of the Black Wall Street tragedy. So we're hoping everybody will be there. And I personally would like to thank you also for your final comments. We thank you for that, and we appreciate all of the well thought out and well spoken things that you share with us every time you meet with us. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Fred.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Thank you.
You're
Have a
welcome.
great day, everybody.
See ya. Bye.